It was a bright afternoon, the kind where the sun hit the city streets just right and people hurried about with their own plans. Some carried shopping bags, others looked glued to their phones, and a few just strolled, enjoying the moment. Among them was a woman who had spent most of her morning in uniform, behind a desk filled with reports and responsibilities. She was a police captain, known in her department for her calm leadership and steady hand during chaos. But today she wasn't wearing her badge or her uniform. She was just herself, an off-duty officer looking to enjoy a few quiet hours. After leaving the precinct, she decided to stop by a department store on her way home. Her plan was simple: pick up a few things she needed, maybe browse a little, and then grab a coffee before heading back. She parked her car, locked it, and walked toward the store, unaware that the next hour would turn her normal day into something she would never forget. Inside the store, the soft music and scent of fresh fabric filled the air. She smiled as she picked up a new pair of gloves, something simple she needed for the colder days coming. She moved through the aisles casually, looking at scarves, wallets, and a few small items for her home. Everything about her body language showed calmness. She wasn't in a rush, wasn't nervous, and wasn't acting suspicious in any way. Still not far behind, 2 store security guards were watching her closely. They had noticed her almost as soon as she entered. It wasn't because she had done anything wrong. It was because of what they thought they saw. They didn't see a respected police captain with years of service and leadership. They saw someone who, to them, looked out of place. One whispered something to the other, and they both nodded quietly, pretending to fix something on the shelf while keeping her in sight. The captain didn't notice. She was focused on her shopping, walking over to the grocery section next. She picked up a few snacks, checked her list on her phone, and placed a few items into her shopping basket. She even smiled politely at an older woman who passed by. Everything about her behavior was ordinary, yet the 2 security guards had already made up their minds. They started whispering into their radios, describing her and what she was holding. "She's putting items into her bag," one said, misreading what she was doing. In truth, she was just shifting her basket to her arm and tucking her phone into her purse. But assumptions are powerful, and soon those assumptions would set off a chain of events no one could stop. When she was done shopping, she walked to the checkout counter, waited in line, and paid for her items. The cashier scanned everything, handed her a receipt, and even said, "Have a good day." She thanked them with a small smile, placed her items into a paper bag, and started walking toward the exit. That's when things took a sharp turn. The moment she crossed the first set of doors, 2 uniformed officers entered through the other side. They had received a call from store security reporting a possible shoplifting suspect. They were told a woman had been seen placing items in her bag and leaving without paying. Without checking the facts or asking the store to confirm anything, the officers came in ready to act. The captain noticed them walking quickly in her direction, but she didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were responding to something else, but within seconds one officer called out to her. "Ma'am, stop right there." She turned around a little confused. "Yes, officer? Is something wrong?" The officers didn't answer immediately. One of them motioned to her shopping bag and said, "What's in the bag?" She blinked, trying to understand. "These are my things. I just paid for them," she replied, still calm. She held up the receipt she had just been handed. "See? I have the receipt right here." But the officers didn't seem to care. They exchanged a quick glance, then stepped closer. "We got a report that you took items without paying," one said. "That's not true," she answered softly. "I paid for everything. You can check the cameras if you want." Her voice was steady, but her heart started to sink. She had worked in law enforcement long enough to recognize the tone they were using. It wasn't one of curiosity or fairness. It was the tone of assumption, the same kind she had spent her whole career trying to correct in others. The officers didn't look at her receipt. Instead, one of them reached toward her bag. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to hand that over," he said firmly. "Of course," she replied, handing it to him calmly. He began checking through it, pulling out each item while people around started slowing down to watch. A few whispered to one another. Some even pulled out their phones. The captain could feel their stares and the quiet judgment, the curiosity, the disbelief. She tried to speak, but one officer cut her off. "Ma'am, please step aside." "I'm telling you I didn't steal anything," she said gently, trying to stay composed. But inside, a mix of anger and sadness was starting to grow. She had always believed that the badge she wore meant fairness, respect, and integrity. Now she was being treated as though none of that mattered. "Please, let me explain." "Ma'am, don't make this harder." The officer interrupted again. His voice grew sharper now, as if her calmness itself was a problem. She looked around. People were still staring. The security guard stood at a distance, arms crossed, almost proud of what they had caused. One of the officers pulled out handcuffs. "Turn around, ma'am," he ordered. Her stomach dropped. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice still low but firm. "I'm not who you think I am." "Then we'll sort it out at the station," the officer replied, not listening. She didn't resist. She had taught countless younger officers about staying calm in tense situations. Now she was living that lesson in the hardest way possible. She turned around and let them cuff her hands. The cold metal touched her wrists and she exhaled slowly. The store had gone silent except for the beeping of a register somewhere in the background. A few people shook their heads, others filmed quietly, and one child whispered to their parent, "Why are they arresting her?" No one answered. As the officers led her out, she could see her reflection in the glass doors. Calm face, shopping bag left behind, cuffs glinting in the afternoon light. She had spent years earning the respect of her peers, training new officers and protecting her community. Yet here she was being treated as a criminal because she didn't fit someone's idea of what innocent looked like. They placed her in the back of the patrol car, and as the door shut, the world outside blurred through the tinted glass. She sat quietly, her mind replaying everything, the looks, the words, the disbelief. She wondered if any of those officers would recognize her name when they processed her. She wondered if they would feel the weight of what they had done. The drive to the station felt long. She kept her eyes on the passing buildings, thinking about how quickly perception could change someone's reality. Just an hour ago, she had been the one giving commands, leading investigations, and now she was being treated like a suspect. When they arrived, one officer opened the door and guided her out. His tone had softened slightly, but it was too late. The damage was already done. She followed quietly, holding her head high, knowing that the truth would come out soon enough. Inside the station, as they began the usual process, paperwork, questions, formalities, she stayed silent. She knew this system better than anyone, and she knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. What they didn't know was that behind that calm expression, a storm was brewing, not of rage, but of realization. This wasn't just about her. It was about something much larger, something that went beyond one misunderstanding in a store. By the time they would finally learn who she really was, it would already be too late to undo the humiliation, the stares, and the quiet ache that came from being judged not by truth, but by perception. And as she sat there in that small room, still in handcuffs, one thought kept echoing in her mind. How many others had gone through the same thing without anyone ever believing them? The room was quiet except for the faint hum of a computer and the sound of a printer working slowly in the corner. The captain sat still on a metal chair, her hands resting on her lap. The handcuffs had been removed, but the cold imprint of the metal still lingered on her wrists. Across from her, the two officers who had arrested her were typing on their computers, avoiding eye contact. Every sound felt louder than usual, the clicking of the keyboard, the ringing of a phone somewhere in the hallway, even the faint echo of footsteps passing by. The captain knew this room well. She had spent years in similar ones, interviewing suspects, guiding younger officers, teaching them about patience and respect. Now she sat on the other side of that table, quietly watching how easily roles could reverse. One of the officers finally looked up. "Ma'am, we'll need your name and ID," he said, his voice cautious but still carrying a tone of control. She met his eyes calmly.
"My ID is in my wallet," she said.
"It was in the bag you took from me." He nodded, reached for the bag, and opened it. He pulled out her wallet, opened it to find her identification card, and then froze. His eyes widened slightly, but he quickly looked down again, pretending not to react. He didn't say anything, just handed it to his partner. The second officer took the card, his expression changing the moment he saw what it said. The room suddenly felt heavier. He blinked a few times and then looked up at her again. "You're a police captain?" She nodded slowly, saying nothing. The two officers stared at each other. The younger one whispered, "Oh no," under his breath, his face pale. The captain watched them, her face unreadable. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. She had learned long ago that anger often closed doors that truth could open. The older officer cleared his throat. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding," he said quickly. "We were just responding to a call." "Yes," she replied softly. "A call based on an assumption, one that you didn't take time to confirm." He tried to explain, stumbling over his words. We just followed what the store security told us." "They said," she interrupted gently. "They said what they thought they saw. And you believed them without question." Silence filled the air. Neither of them could argue. They both knew she was right. After a moment, the door opened. The watch commander walked in holding a folder. He stopped the moment he saw her sitting there. "Captain?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. His eyes darted to the two officers, then back at her. "What on earth is going on here?" Neither officer could speak. The commander stepped forward quickly. "Captain, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said calmly. "Just a little surprised to be sitting here like this." The commander turned sharply toward the two officers. "Do you realize who this is?" They both nodded, looking down at the floor. The room grew uncomfortably quiet again. The captain could see the guilt in their eyes now. The confidence they had when arresting her was gone, replaced by shame and unease. The commander sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead. "Uncuff her immediately," he said, though she was already free. He then looked at her. "I'm so sorry about this, Captain. There must have been a mistake." "There was," she said simply. "But it wasn't just a mistake, it was a judgment." The commander looked down, understanding her meaning. "You're right," he said quietly. "This shouldn't have happened." She nodded, standing up slowly. "No, it shouldn't have, but it did." As she gathered her things from the table, the two arresting officers stood by awkwardly, still silent. One of them finally spoke. "Captain, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were just doing our job." She looked at him for a moment, then said, "Your job is to find the truth, not to assume it." Her voice wasn't angry. It was steady, calm, and filled with disappointment that cut deeper than yelling ever could. The officer looked down again, unable to respond. The commander offered to drive her home, but she refused politely. "I'll manage," she said. "I just need some air." She walked out of the station quietly, her shopping bag in one hand, her badge in the other. The city outside was still bright and busy, but it felt different now. She had always believed the badge she wore symbolized fairness, a promise that the law would protect everyone equally. But today, she had been reminded that fairness could disappear the moment someone stopped looking past appearances. She walked to her car slowly, feeling a mix of exhaustion and reflection. As she sat behind the wheel, she didn't start the engine right away. She just sat there, thinking about how easily assumptions could damage trust, even among those who wore the same uniform. Later that evening, she received a call from the commander. He apologized again, promising to look into the incident. "We'll handle it internally," he said. "I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." But she knew promises like that often faded once the headlines did. Still, she thanked him and hung up. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her uniform hung neatly on the chair across from her, the same one she had worn proudly for years. She looked at it for a long moment. The badge gleamed softly under the light, but it didn't bring her comfort like it used to. Her mind kept replaying the afternoon, the faces, the tone, the disbelief. She remembered how the officers never once asked for her side of the story before cuffing her. They didn't even check the cameras. They saw what they wanted to see. She thought about how many people had gone through the same thing but didn't have a badge to protect them later. How many were never believed? How many were judged before they ever got to speak? The thought hurt more than her own humiliation. For years, she had trained new recruits on communication, empathy, and community trust. She reminded them that authority didn't mean superiority. It meant responsibility. But in that store, none of that mattered. Her experience, her title, her years of service, all invisible the moment bias took over. As the hours passed, she decided she wouldn't stay silent. She wouldn't seek revenge or public attention, that wasn't her way. But she would make sure the lesson reached every officer in her department, not through anger, but through understanding. The next morning, she arrived at work early. The usual greetings were quieter than normal. News of what had happened had already spread through the department. Some people avoided eye contact. Others offered apologetic smiles. The two officers who had arrested her were nowhere to be seen. They had been sent home pending review. When the commander saw her, he walked over immediately. "Captain, are you sure you're ready to be here?" he asked gently. "I'm always ready," she said. "But I think it's time we talk about what happened." They walked into a meeting room where a few senior officers had gathered. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a deeper problem. She stood at the front of the room, looking at her team, men and women she had worked with for years. Some she had trained herself. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," she began softly. "I wasn't treated unfairly because of my actions. I was treated unfairly because of how I looked in that moment. That's not just a mistake. That's a warning." The room stayed silent. Her words sank in. "We can't protect people if we can't see them as human first," she continued. "The badge means nothing if we forget that." She paused, letting that sentence sit in the air. This isn't about anger or embarrassment. It's about growth. If we want to earn trust, we have to start by looking in the mirror, all of us. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others nodded quietly. The commander looked at her with quiet respect. When the meeting ended, she returned to her office. She sat down, looking out the window at the city below. The day looked ordinary again. Cars moving, people walking, sirens echoing faintly in the distance. But she knew nothing about this week would be ordinary again. She had been reminded that even good people could make bad choices when blinded by bias. And she also knew that change didn't start with anger. It started with awareness. As she picked up her badge again, she felt its weight differently this time. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of what could go wrong, and of what needed to be made right. She clipped it to her belt, stood up and whispered to herself, "Let's make this mean something again." Then she walked out of her office, ready to turn her painful experience into a lesson that could change her department. And maybe, one day, her entire city. The following days moved slower than usual. Every step inside the station felt different now. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and though no one said it directly, everyone knew what had happened. It was in their eyes. The quiet discomfort, the half smiles, the sympathetic looks that said more than words ever could. The captain carried herself as she always had. Calm, composed, steady. But inside, something had changed. There was a weight in her chest, a quiet ache she couldn't easily shake off. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Disappointment in how easily trust could be broken, even among those who wore the same uniform. One morning, as she walked into her office, she found a folded note on her desk. It wasn't signed. It simply read, "You didn't deserve that." "I'm sorry." She stared at it for a while, then placed it in her drawer. Small gestures like that meant something. Not because they erased what happened, but because they showed someone still cared enough to acknowledge it. Later that day, the commander called her in for a meeting. He looked tired, his eyes heavy with concern. "Captain," he began, "the department's internal review is underway. They've spoken to the officers involved, and they're reviewing the store's footage. It's clear now you did nothing wrong." She nodded quietly. "I already knew that," she said softly. "I know," he replied, lowering his voice. "But I also know this must have shaken your faith in the system." She looked at him for a long moment. "It hasn't shaken my faith," she said. "But it's made me see how fragile it really is." He leaned back in his chair. "The officers are feeling terrible about it. They've asked if they could apologize to you directly." She thought about that for a moment, then said, "They can, but I want it to be meaningful. Not just an apology because it's expected, but because they understand why what they did was wrong." The commander nodded. "I understand. I'll arrange it." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, she stayed in her office long after most people had left. She looked out the window, watching the lights flicker on across the streets. Somewhere below, people were living their lives, shopping, talking, laughing, completely unaware of what she had been through. She envied them a little. Her thoughts drifted to her early days in the force. Back then she had been full of hope. She believed that every officer wanted to do the right thing, that the badge automatically meant fairness. Over the years, she learned that wasn't always true. People brought their biases with them into the job even if they didn't mean to. Some recognized it and worked on it. Others didn't. The next morning, she met with the two officers in a small conference room. They stood when she entered, their faces a mixture of guilt and unease. The air felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath. "Captain," one of them began quietly, "we just wanted to say we're sorry. Truly. We should have handled everything differently." She studied them for a moment before speaking. "What made you believe I was guilty?" They looked at each other. The older one finally said, "It wasn't personal. We just got a call from security and we reacted based on what we were told." She nodded slowly. "And you didn't question it?" The younger officer lowered his head. "No, ma'am. Did you look at me and see someone who looked like they could be a thief?" She asked gently. He hesitated. I guess we saw what we were expecting to see." Her expression softened, but her voice stayed firm. "That's the problem. You were expecting something, and your expectations blinded you from the truth. That's what bias does. It makes people see what they already believe, not what's actually in front of them." The room went silent. Both officers looked down ashamed. "I'm not angry at you," she continued, "but I need you to understand how easily this could have gone differently. What if I wasn't calm? What if I had reacted with fear like many innocent people do? You might have thought I was resisting. And then," she paused, letting the thought hang, "it could have been worse." They both nodded slowly, realizing the depth of what she was saying. "I became a police officer because I believed in justice," she said quietly. "But justice only works when we're willing to look beyond our assumptions. You both made a mistake. I've made mistakes too. But what matters now is what you do with it." The officers promised to do better, not in words but in effort. She could see it in their eyes. They had been humbled, and sometimes humility was the first step toward real change. After the meeting, the commander approached her. "That was powerful," he said. "You handled it better than I would have." "It's not about handling it," she replied. "It's about learning from it." In the weeks that followed, she started something new. She asked the department to introduce workshops on racial bias and situational awareness, not as a punishment, but as education. "We can't fix what we refuse to face," she said during her proposal. At first, some officers grumbled quietly. They didn't like the idea of being told they might have biases, but as time went on, the sessions began to change the way people thought. Officers shared their experiences, their mistakes, and even their regrets. For many, it was the first time they realized how unconscious bias could influence even small decisions. The captain didn't lead the sessions at first. She wanted people to speak freely. But when she finally did, the room grew silent. Everyone knew her story, but hearing it directly from her made it real in a way they hadn't expected. She stood at the front of the room and spoke gently. "I've worn this uniform for many years," she began, "and I've learned that it's not the uniform that gives us respect. It's how we treat people when we wear it." She looked around at the group, her gaze steady. "We often tell ourselves that we don't judge anyone, that we only act on facts. But the truth is we all carry something inside us, experiences, fears, beliefs, that shape how we see others. The problem isn't having those thoughts. The problem is pretending they don't exist." Some officers nodded quietly. Others avoided her eyes. "When you look at someone, ask yourself, am I seeing this person for who they are or for what I've been told people like them are supposed to be?" She continued. "That one question can change how you act, and that difference could save someone's life, or at least their dignity." Her voice stayed calm, but there was emotion behind every word. She wasn't lecturing them. She was sharing a truth that came from pain. After the session ended, several officers came up to her privately. Some apologized. Some thanked her. Others simply said, "We needed to hear that." That night, as she drove home, she felt something she hadn't felt in a while, a quiet sense of peace. The memory of that day in the store would always stay with her, but now it was starting to transform into something meaningful. Still, there were moments when it hurt. There were nights when she lay awake, thinking about how fast everything had spiraled. She thought about the people who recorded the incident, the faces that watched her being handcuffed, and how they must have talked about it afterward. But she also thought about the lessons that were now spreading across her department, lessons that might prevent someone else from going through the same humiliation. One evening, She attended a community meeting. Residents were gathered to talk about safety and fairness in policing. When she was invited to speak, she hesitated for a moment, then stood. "Something happened to me recently," she told them. "It wasn't easy. It reminded me that even those who work for justice can make mistakes. But it also reminded me that change begins with honesty." The audience listened quietly. Her tone wasn't defensive or proud, it was sincere, almost vulnerable. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone," she said. "And that's why we have to keep talking, keep learning, and keep holding each other accountable. Because the only way to rebuild trust is to face what broke it." When she finished speaking, the room erupted in quiet applause. Not the loud, hollow kind, but the gentle, heartfelt kind that comes from people who truly understand. Driving home that night, she felt lighter. The road ahead still stretched long, but for the first time in weeks it didn't feel lonely. She knew that what she had gone through wasn't just her story anymore. It had become a mirror for others, a way to see what needed changing. And as she pulled into her driveway, she looked up at the night sky and whispered to herself, maybe this was supposed to happen. Not to break me, but to wake others up. The days turned into weeks, and the story of what had happened to the captain continued to travel quietly through the department and the city. At first it was just whispers, a few mentions in meetings, conversations over coffee, small talk in the hallways. But soon local media caught wind of it. Headlines began to appear, not in an aggressive or scandalous way, but questioning how something like this could happen. An off-duty police captain, mistaken for a thief by her own. The department released a short statement, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the truth was, people wanted more than that. The community wanted answers. For years they had been asking for fair treatment, for understanding, for change. And now, even someone within the department had experienced what they had been warning about all along. The captain didn't go out of her way to talk to reporters. She wasn't looking for attention. Her goal wasn't to embarrass anyone or to seek revenge. She wanted reflection, not reaction. She wanted people to think. Still, she couldn't avoid the attention completely. One morning when she stopped at a small cafe near the station, a woman approached her hesitantly. "Are you the officer from the news?" she asked. The captain gave a small nod. "I just wanted to say," the woman continued, "thank you for speaking about it. People like me, we go through this kind of thing all the time. But when it happens to someone like you, it makes others listen." The captain smiled softly. "Then maybe something good will come from it," she said. That conversation stayed with her for days. It reminded her that what happened wasn't just her story anymore. It had become a reminder of what still needed to change, not just in her department, but everywhere. Back at the precinct, the commander had started holding regular meetings with senior officers. The atmosphere was more open now, more honest. People were finally talking about the things they used to ignore. Racial bias, snap judgments, the danger of acting before thinking. It wasn't easy, but it was progress. The captain was invited to speak at one of those meetings again. She hesitated at first. Each time she told her story, it brought back the same painful feeling, the disbelief, the embarrassment, the quiet anger. But she also knew that if she stayed silent, nothing would change. When the day came, she stood in front of a packed room of officers. Some were new recruits. Others had been serving for decades. They looked at her with a mix of respect and curiosity. She took a breath and began. "When I walked into that store that day," she said slowly, "I didn't walk in as a police officer. I walked in as a person, just someone doing her errands. But when those officers saw me, they didn't see a person. They saw a problem. That's what bias does. It makes us forget humanity." The room was silent. Every eye was on her. "I know what it feels like to be on the other side now," she continued. "To be treated like a suspect instead of a citizen. And it's a feeling I wouldn't wish on anyone." The worst part wasn't being handcuffed. The worst part was realizing that no one even tried to listen before judging. Her voice was calm but heavy with truth. "Every time we put on this uniform," she said, "we take on a responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to protect the dignity of the people we serve. The way we treat someone, especially when we think they've done something wrong, says more about us than about them." When she finished, the room stayed quiet for a few long seconds before gentle applause began. A few officers even stood up. Not because it was a performance, but because the honesty had reached them deeply. After the meeting, several younger officers approached her. One of them said quietly, "Captain, I never thought about how fast we make judgments. I'll remember what you said next time I'm out there." She smiled softly. "That's all I ask," she said. That evening, she sat alone in her car before heading home. The city lights shimmered across the streets, and for a moment, she just watched the people walking by. She thought about how each one of them carried their own story, stories that couldn't be seen at first glance. She thought about the store where it all happened. She hadn't gone back since that day, but something in her told her she needed to, not out of anger, but for closure. A few days later, she parked outside the same department store. Her heart beat faster than usual as she walked in. Everything looked the same, the aisles, the lights, the soft music. But she saw it differently now. One of the security guards from that day was still there. When he saw her, his expression changed immediately. He looked embarrassed, almost nervous. "Ma'am," he said quickly, "I just want to say how sorry I am for what happened. I never meant for things to go that far." She nodded. "I know," she said quietly, "but it did. And it's important you understand why." He swallowed hard, nodding. "I do now," he said. "I've been thinking about it ever since. I realized I made assumptions that day. I didn't even realize how fast I judged someone just based on how they looked." The captain looked at him, her tone soft but firm. "That's how change starts, when you see it for yourself. Just make sure it doesn't happen again, not to anyone." He nodded again, his eyes sincere. "It won't," he said. As she walked out of the store, she felt lighter. The past couldn't be erased, but she had faced it, and sometimes that was enough to start healing. The following week, she was invited to speak at a public event on community and law enforcement trust. She didn't like the spotlight, but she agreed. She knew the message mattered more than her comfort. When she stood on stage, lights shining softly over her, she looked out at the audience, police officers, community leaders, and everyday citizens sitting side by side. She began in a voice steady, but heartfelt. "A few months ago," she said, "I was reminded that anyone, no matter their title or position, can be seen differently when bias clouds judgment. I've worn a uniform for many years, and I've seen both the good and the bad sides of this profession. But I still believe in what it stands for. I believe we can do better." She paused, scanning the room. "What happened to me wasn't just about one mistake. It was about the way we sometimes see each other. We forget that behind every uniform, every label, every color, there's a person, someone's parent, someone's child, someone just trying to live their day." Her words weren't rehearsed. They came from the heart. She continued, "When we start seeing each other as people first, we stop making the kind of mistakes that break trust. And maybe, just maybe, we can rebuild what was lost." The audience sat in quiet reflection. For the first time, many of them truly understood how deeply bias could hurt, not just the victims, but everyone involved. After the event, several people approached her to thank her. Some were officers, some were civilians. One elderly man said softly, "You made me believe change is possible again." That night, when she returned home, she felt something she hadn't in a while, peace mixed with purpose. She knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be more work to do, more conversations to have, more hearts to reach. But for now, she felt proud. Not because she had been wronged, but because she had turned that pain into something that could help others. As she sat by her window, looking out at the quiet night, she thought about how far she'd come since that afternoon in the store. The hurt had turned into strength. The humiliation had turned into understanding. And the silence that once filled her with doubt had now become a voice, one that people were finally listening to. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, maybe that's what real justice looks like, and not punishment, but growth. The next morning, when she walked into the station, the air felt lighter. People greeted her with warmth and respect. The same officers who once whispered now looked at her with admiration. She didn't need recognition, she just needed them to understand, and they did. For the first time in a long while, the department didn't just talk about change. It started living it, and for the captain, that was enough. The months that followed brought quiet change, not the kind that comes from headlines or orders, but from reflection. Inside the police department, people had started talking to each other differently. The officers who once avoided hard conversations about bias were now sitting together, listening, learning, and even sharing their own stories. The incident with the captain had changed something deep in their culture. It reminded them that wearing a badge didn't make them immune to mistakes. It made them responsible for correcting them. The captain returned to her normal duties. She still led her team with calm authority, still started her mornings with strong coffee and early briefings, still walked through the halls with that same quiet strength. But there was something new in her presence now, a kind of grace that came from surviving something painful and turning it into purpose. Every now and then, when she crossed paths with the officers who had detained her, they greeted her respectfully. There was still a trace of discomfort in their eyes, but also humility. They had attended every training session she had helped design. They had stood up in front of their peers and spoken about what they had learned. They were different now, and though she never said it aloud, she was proud of them for that. One morning, she sat in her office reviewing reports when a knock came at her door. It was one of those same officers. He looked nervous but determined. "Captain," he said quietly, "I just wanted to thank you for not giving up on us after what happened." She looked up from her papers and gave a small smile. "I didn't need to give up on you," she said. "You just needed to see what I already knew, that you can do better." He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see it now. That day, it still stays in my mind. I've learned to look at people differently. I take a breath before I act. I listen more. It's not the same anymore." "Good," she said softly. "That's how change begins, one moment at a time." He left and she sat there for a while thinking about his words. It wasn't just about that one day anymore. It was about the countless silent lessons that followed. Outside, the community was also shifting. The department began holding open meetings where citizens could share their experiences directly with officers. There were honest discussions, sometimes uncomfortable but real. The captain attended many of them. She didn't speak much unless asked, but when she did, people listened. One evening at one of these gatherings, a young woman stood up and said, "I used to be afraid to call the police. I didn't think anyone would believe me or treat me fairly. But seeing how things have changed, how officers actually talk to us now, it gives me hope." Those words stayed with the captain. They weren't dramatic, but they carried meaning. Hope was something rare in those conversations, and now it was starting to return. Weeks later, she received a call from the city's police academy. They wanted her to speak to a new group of recruits, fresh faces eager to begin their careers. She hesitated for a moment, then agreed. If there was any place change could grow strongest, it was with the new generation. The day of the talk, she walked into the large hall filled with young trainees in crisp uniforms. Their eyes followed her as she stepped to the front. She looked around, taking a quiet breath, and began in a calm, steady voice. "When I first joined this job," she said, "I thought the hardest part would be catching criminals or solving cases. But over time, I realized the hardest part is learning to see people clearly, without letting your fears or assumptions cloud your judgment." She paused, letting that sink in. "A few months ago," she continued, "I was arrested by my own officers. They didn't recognize me. They didn't ask questions. They saw what they thought was a problem, not a person. And for a few minutes, I wasn't a captain. I wasn't even an officer. I was just someone being judged by how I looked." The room fell completely silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioner in the background. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," she said softly. "I'm telling you because it's easy to think it won't happen to you, that you'd never make that kind of mistake. But the truth is, none of us are perfect. Bias isn't something bad people have. It's something all people have. The only difference is whether you're willing to face it." She looked around the room, her voice steady. "So when you go out there, remember, every person you stop, question, or talk to is human. You might not know their story, but you owe them respect. And if you ever make a mistake, own it, learn from it, and make sure it doesn't happen again." When she finished, there was no applause at first, just quiet reflection. Then slowly, one by one, the recruits began to clap. It wasn't loud or forced, and it was sincere.